It all began on a late afternoon as I was driving home from my parents' house. I had been there for several weeks, helping to finish a long overdue renovation project. It was hard work, but satisfying in its own way. My hands were still sore from handling tools, and my mind was on getting home, having a hot meal, and finally putting my feet up. As I approached the driveway, something felt off. The usual calm of the neighborhood was replaced with faint sounds of chaos coming from inside my house. It wasn't clear what was going on, but it wasn't normal. I parked the car and stepped out, my senses heightened. As I entered the house, the noises became more distinct: thuds, scraping, and something that sounded like distant yelling. My first instinct was to ensure safety. I quickly moved to the drawer where I kept my pistol. A cautious man by nature, I believed in being prepared. With the gun firmly in hand, I took deliberate steps into the living room. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The place looked like a storm had passed through it. Furniture was pushed aside, wallpaper peeled off in strips, and the usual orderliness I maintained was completely gone. For a moment, I thought the house had been ransacked. "What is going on here?" I called out, my voice steady but firm. My wife appeared from the kitchen, looking oddly composed despite the destruction around her. She didn't seem alarmed at all, which was even more confusing. "There's a problem we need to fix," she began, as if this explanation would suffice. I lowered the pistol, still scanning the room. She pointed at the walls, gesturing to the torn wallpaper and scratched surfaces. "The house is in terrible shape," she said. "I decided it's time for a full renovation." Her tone was matter-of-fact, like she was talking about rearranging furniture, not tearing apart the entire house. "You decided?" I asked, my disbelief evident. "I just spent weeks finishing up a renovation at my parents' place, and now you're telling me I'm walking into another project." She nodded enthusiastically, as if this was exciting news. "But this isn't simple," I continued. "A renovation like this takes planning, money, and a proper team. It's not something I can just throw together on my own." "Relax," she said, brushing off my concerns. "I've already thought this through. We're meeting someone tomorrow who can handle everything." Her confidence was unsettling. I'm a man who believes in doing things right, not rushing into decisions. "Who exactly are we meeting?" I asked, my skepticism clear. "A friend of mine. Her husband is a professional. He handles renovations, designs, projects, the whole package," she explained. "Is he an engineer? Does he have a team?" I pressed, trying to gauge how legitimate this sounded. She rolled her eyes slightly, as if my questioning was unnecessary. "Yes, he has a team. He's done incredible work on my friend's house. You'll see for yourself. Don't worry about the details, they're all sorted." I wasn't entirely convinced. Renovations weren't just about skill, they were about trust and accountability. But she seemed adamant. "Tomorrow is your day off, isn't it?" she continued, shifting the conversation back to logistics. "We're meeting them first thing. It's an important meeting, so I need you to make a good impression." She said this with a sense of finality, as if the decision had already been made and my role was merely to follow through. I stared at the mess around me, feeling a mix of frustration and resignation. Whatever she had planned, it seemed I had little choice but to go along with it. At the very least, I'd see what this so-called professional had to offer. The next morning, we set off early, heading to a small town where my wife's friend lived. It was an unusually long drive, made worse by my growing apprehension. She had mentioned this friend before, though not in the most flattering terms. The woman had a reputation for being unreliable, someone who jumped from one relationship to another and didn't hesitate to throw others under the bus when it suited her. It baffled me why my wife thought it was a good idea to involve her in something as significant as our home renovation. When we arrived, the house was modest but well maintained. My wife rang the doorbell, and within moments, the door swung open. I recognized the woman instantly. She hadn't changed much since the last time I saw her, though there was something oddly subdued about her demeanor. Gone was the brazen attitude I remembered. She greeted us warmly, even cheerfully, as if she hadn't spent years cultivating a reputation for being difficult. My wife nudged me to step inside, though I hesitated, shooting her a look that said everything I was thinking. "She's different now," my wife whispered, rolling her eyes at my reluctance. I followed her inside, still skeptical. The woman led us to the living room, offering us coffee and asking us to make ourselves comfortable. It was bizarre. The last time I'd seen her, she wouldn't have thought twice about dismissing someone outright. Now, she was practically the picture of hospitality. I sat down but didn't relax, keeping my guard up. I wasn't about to let my past impressions cloud my judgment entirely, but I wasn't convinced of her supposed transformation either. As we waited, I turned to my wife. "Are you sure you want to trust her?" "She's not exactly known for reliability," I said quietly. My wife sighed, clearly exasperated. "People change," she said. "Ever since she got married, she's turned over a new leaf. Just wait and see." Her confidence annoyed me, but I decided to keep my thoughts to myself. It wasn't worth an argument, not yet, anyway. Soon after, her husband joined us. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of authority about him. He greeted us politely and introduced himself. Despite my reservations about his wife, I couldn't deny that he seemed competent and professional. We began discussing the renovation project, and my wife wasted no time outlining her vision. She spoke enthusiastically about transforming our home, her excitement evident in every word. I mostly listened, occasionally chiming in with practical concerns about costs and timelines. The man nodded along, taking notes and asking relevant questions. He seemed to know his stuff, which was reassuring. "I'll bring my team over on Sunday to take a look at the house," he said. "We'll evaluate the scope of work and give you a detailed plan afterward." His confidence was contagious, even if I still had my doubts about the whole arrangement. My wife beamed, clearly thrilled that things were moving forward. I remained reserved, unwilling to get too optimistic until I saw results. As the conversation wrapped up, he added a final note. "Just a heads up," he said. "My team is unique. They're young guys, full of energy, and sometimes their behavior can be a bit, let's say, unorthodox. If they say or do anything that seems out of line, don't take it personally. They're good at what they do, and that's what matters." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. My wife seemed unbothered, nodding along as if it were a minor detail. We thanked them for their time and hospitality before heading back home. The drive felt shorter this time, but my mind was still racing. There were too many variables, too many unknowns. My wife, however, seemed perfectly at ease, already talking about how great everything would turn out. I kept my thoughts to myself, deciding to wait and see how Sunday's visit would unfold. The last day of my weekend began earlier than expected. I woke up to the sound of my wife tearing down wallpaper in the living room. She had been at it since dawn, the noise of ripping paper echoing through the house. Groaning, I rolled out of bed and realized I hadn't even had time to wash up when there was a sharp knock at the door. Still in my boxers, I quickly threw on some clothes and went to see who it was. What greeted me was nothing short of a spectacle. Standing on my porch was a group of young men, looking more like they belonged on a runway than at a renovation site. One of them, dressed in a beige designer suit, seemed to be the self-proclaimed leader. Behind him was a mix of casually dressed guys, each carrying an air of nonchalance. Before I could even get a word in, they barged in, their voices filling the space with loud chatter and crude jokes. Some of their remarks were directed at the state of the house, others at the torn wallpaper. It was enough to make my blood boil. "Hey, keep it professional," I snapped at one of them who had gone too far. My voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. The leader quickly stepped in, apologizing on behalf of the group. "Don't mind them," he said with a sheepish smile. "They're just excited to get started." I didn't buy the excuse but decided not to escalate things further. Instead, I crossed my arms and waited for them to begin their assessment. The team spread out, examining every corner of the house with surprising efficiency. Despite their initial behavior, it was clear they knew what they were doing. My wife joined them, eagerly pointing out areas she wanted renovated. "Don't forget to check the basement," she said, her enthusiasm borderline contagious. I frowned. "Why the basement?" I asked. "It's just a storage space for junk." "What's the point?" She waved me off with a vague explanation about having special plans for the area, promising to share the details later. I didn't press her, but made a mental note to follow up. As the group moved downstairs, I stayed close behind, observing their every move. The basement, like I said, was cluttered with old boxes and forgotten items. Yet, the team seemed unfazed. They measured walls, checked the flooring, and even discussed potential layouts among themselves. Their professionalism in this moment was a stark contrast to their earlier antics. Still, I couldn't ignore the hushed conversations and occasional glances they exchanged. Something about it felt off, but I chose to let it slide for now. After thoroughly inspecting the house, they regrouped in the living room to discuss their findings. The leader presented their estimate, and I was genuinely surprised. The cost was far lower than I had anticipated. "Why so affordable?" I asked, skeptical of the offer. "We're not overhauling the structure," he explained. "It's mostly cosmetic work, plus a few furniture upgrades. Nothing too complicated." His reasoning made sense, but I remained cautious. My wife, however, seemed thrilled. She nodded enthusiastically, agreeing to their terms without hesitation. Before we wrapped up, the leader added one final detail. "Usually, we take payment upfront," he said. "But since your wife is a friend of my wife, we'll handle the legalities and payments after the work is completed. Does that work for you?" His offer was unexpected but intriguing. The idea of paying only after seeing results was appealing. It showed confidence in their ability to deliver, which I respected. After a brief pause, I extended my hand. "All right," I said. "You've got a deal." After that day, the renovation work began in earnest. Each morning, I left for work as usual, while my wife stayed home to oversee the progress. The team of builders arrived promptly and got to work, their noisy presence a constant reminder that the house was undergoing a transformation. Days turned into weeks, and I could see changes taking shape. The living room looked brighter, the kitchen more modern, and even the upstairs bedrooms began to feel refreshed. My wife seemed to thrive in her role as the on-site manager, keeping everything on schedule and making sure the workers stuck to the plan. One evening, I came home exhausted from a long day at the office. The house was quieter than usual. The workers had already packed up and left for the day, leaving behind a faint scent of sawdust and fresh paint. As I walked through the house, I couldn't help but notice how much progress had been made. However, my thoughts kept circling back to one thing, the basement. I had completely forgotten about my wife's earlier mention of wanting to renovate it. It wasn't until I saw a stack of materials by the basement door that I remembered. Curious, I called out to her. She appeared moments later, still holding a clipboard filled with notes. "What's the deal with the basement?" I asked. "Why are we even bothering with it? It's just a place for storing junk." She smiled, clearly anticipating the question. "I've got big plans for that space," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Think about it, we've been using it as a dumping ground, but it has so much potential. I want to turn it into a special area, something unique." I raised an eyebrow. "Special how?" She launched into a description of her vision, painting a picture of cozy furniture, an enormous bookshelf, and mood lighting in rich, warm tones. "It'll be a perfect retreat," she said. "A place where we can relax, read, or even entertain guests." It sounded ambitious, almost too ambitious. "And you're sure this is worth the effort?" I asked. She nodded confidently. "Absolutely. But to make it happen, I need to take care of a few details with someone who's helping me finalize the design." That caught my attention. "Who are you meeting?" I asked, narrowing my eyes slightly. Just someone who's helping me bring the idea to life, she replied vaguely. Don't worry about it. It's all under control. Her nonchalant attitude didn't sit entirely well with me, but I decided not to push. She had been managing the project competently so far, and I didn't want to micromanage. So, when do I get to see this masterpiece? I joked, trying to lighten the mood. She laughed. Soon enough, she said. But for now, I need you to handle something important. Tomorrow, the builders will be back to start working on the basement. I have a meeting in the afternoon and might be late. Can you keep an eye on things while I'm gone? I hesitated for a moment, considering her request. Supervising the workers wasn't exactly how I wanted to spend my evening, but it seemed reasonable enough. All right, I said. I'll make sure everything runs smoothly. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek before heading back to her notes. That night, as I sat in the living room, I couldn't help but think about the project. The house was shaping up nicely, and while I had my reservations about the basement, I trusted her judgment. For now, my focus was on making sure the workers did their job properly. Whatever she had planned for the space, I'd find out soon enough. The next day, I got up early, ready to take on the task. As my wife prepared to leave for her meeting, she reminded me once again. Keep an eye on them, she said. They're good, but they need supervision. I nodded, determined to do my part. Whatever her grand vision for the basement was, I'd make sure it started on the right foot. The next day, I arrived home after a long shift at work. The house was quiet, just as my wife had warned me it would be. She was out, and the builders had already arrived to continue their work on the basement. As I stepped inside, I could hear voices from downstairs. At first, I thought nothing of it, just the usual noise of people talking on the job. But then, I caught fragments of their conversation, and what I heard made my blood run cold. They weren't discussing work. Their words were vulgar and laced with inappropriate remarks about my wife. The kind of talk that no man would tolerate about someone he cared for. At that moment, any sense of patience I had left evaporated. Without hesitation, I made my way downstairs. The group fell silent as I entered, clearly caught off guard by my sudden presence. I walked straight up to one of them, a young guy with a cocky demeanor who seemed to be the ringleader of their crude jokes. Grabbing him by the collar, I lifted him just enough to make my point clear. You want to repeat that? I asked, my voice steady but filled with unmistakable anger. His face went pale, and he stammered, "Man, you must have misheard. We weren't talking about your wife. It's just someone with the same name, that's all." I let him go, but my glare lingered. "Watch your mouth," I said firmly. "Next time, there won't be a warning." The room was tense as I turned and walked away. I didn't need to say more, they got the message. As I headed back upstairs, I could feel their eyes on me, but I didn't care. Respect was non-negotiable. Later that evening, my wife returned home, looking as cheerful as ever. She immediately began talking about the progress the builders had made, oblivious to the confrontation that had taken place earlier. I interrupted her to explain what had happened, recounting the incident in detail. Her reaction was a mix of frustration and exasperation. "Why is it that every time I leave you alone, you end up in some kind of standoff?" she asked, rolling her eyes. "And what was I supposed to do?" I shot back. "Let them talk like that without consequence." She sighed. "No, but maybe next time, handle it a bit more diplomatically. We still need these guys to finish the job. The last thing I want is for them to sabotage the work out of spite." I understood her point, but I wasn't about to apologize for defending her honor. "Fine," I said, "but they're on thin ice as far as I'm concerned." After dinner, she changed the subject, her tone lightening as she shared some news. "By the way," she said, "I spoke to the husband of my friend earlier. He mentioned the incident and asked if everything was okay. I assured him it's under control, but it looks like the builders might have said something to him, too." I wasn't surprised. Gossip traveled fast in situations like these. Still, I was glad the matter hadn't escalated further. Before heading to bed, she mentioned another update about the project. "So, there's someone coming in a few days," she began. "He's going to help with a graphic visualization of what the basement will look like. Apparently, he's an expert, but also unique." She gave me a knowing look, as if preparing me for someone eccentric. "Just a heads up so you're not caught off guard." I nodded, taking her words in stride. At this point, nothing about this renovation could surprise me. "All right," I said. "Let's see what this guy has to offer." Another weekend rolled around, and I was at home trying to catch up on some much-needed rest. My wife had been out for most of the morning, running errands for the renovation project. When she finally returned, she wasn't alone. She walked in with a man who, to put it mildly, was unlike anyone I'd ever seen. He was covered in tattoos, with piercings in places I didn't even think were possible. His style was loud, almost deliberately provocative, and it immediately set the tone for what was going to be a very unusual interaction. The man introduced himself with an overly casual demeanor, extending a hand as if we'd been friends for years. "Your wife's told me about the basement project," he said, his voice dripping with enthusiasm. "So, have you heard the full plan yet?" I shook his hand reluctantly and replied, "Not entirely." My wife stood nearby, watching with a mix of amusement and anticipation as he led the way down to the basement. Once downstairs, he pulled out a high-end tablet and began taking pictures of the space from every angle. His movements were quick and efficient, clearly practiced. "All right, let me show you what I've got in mind," he said, pulling up a digital sketchpad on the screen. Within minutes, he had drawn a detailed layout of the room. He pointed to one corner. "Here, we'll install a custom-designed intimate chair." Then, moving to the opposite side, he added, "And over here, a large crossfall, well, you get the idea." I froze, staring at him in disbelief. "Stop," I said, cutting him off. "What is this supposed to be?" He looked at me as if I'd just asked a silly question. "It's an intimate space," he said matter-of-factly. "Your wife was very clear about wanting something unique, something liberating." His explanation didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. I turned to my wife, who was standing silently, watching my reaction with a sheepish smile. "Is this true?" I asked her, trying to keep my composure. She shrugged. "Why not?" she said. "I thought it'd be something fun, something different. I'm doing this for us, you know. To spice things up a bit." Her nonchalant attitude only added to my frustration. "I thought this was supposed to be a cozy reading room," I said. "You know, bookshelves, a couch, something simple and comfortable. This is not what I had in mind." She stepped closer, her tone softening. "Look," she said. "You've been working so hard, and I just wanted to do something special for us. It's not like it's set in stone. If you really don't want it, we can rethink the design." Her attempt to pacify me was partially effective. I sighed, deciding it wasn't worth a fight. "Fine," I said. "But let's keep it reasonable. No surprises." The man wrapped up his presentation quickly after that, sensing the tension in the room. As he packed up his things, he complimented my wife on her vision and assured her the final design would be perfect. I wasn't convinced, but I kept my opinions to myself. As he left, my wife walked him to the door, thanking him for his time and effort. When she returned, she brought up another topic. "By the way," she said, "the lead builder wants to talk to you about something important. He's stopping by tomorrow. I'm not sure what it's about, but he said it's crucial." I raised an eyebrow, curious, but not overly concerned. "All right," I said. "We'll see what he has to say." It was another long day at work when I got home to find the lead builder waiting for me. His expression was serious, and I could tell right away that something wasn't right. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside. Without wasting time, he laid it out plainly. The costs for the basement renovation had spiraled beyond the original estimate. "Your wife updated the project," he explained, "and it's a lot more extensive now. Unfortunately, this means the total cost is significantly higher than we initially discussed. He named the figure, and I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process the number. Before I could respond, my wife appeared in the doorway. Her face was a mix of worry and determination. She must have overheard the conversation because she immediately began pleading her case. "Look, I know it's more than we planned," she said, "but just think about how amazing it's going to be when it's finished. We're already halfway there. The living room and kitchen are practically done. This is the home we've always dreamed of." I raised a hand to stop her. "Let me think," I said firmly. Turning to the builder, I added, "Can we pause the construction for a couple of days? I need time to figure out how we're going to handle this." He nodded, understanding my position. "No problem," he said. "We'll hold off until you're ready." With that, he left, leaving me and my wife to sort through the mess. Once we were alone, she started again. "Please," she said, her voice soft and almost pleading. "I know it's a lot, but just imagine how beautiful it will be. This is for us, for our future. We've already come so far. If we stop now, all this work will be for nothing." I could see the hope in her eyes, but her words only added to my frustration. "You do realize," I said, "that I'm the one paying for all of this? It's my job that's funding your dream house, not yours." She didn't back down. If anything, she doubled down, painting a picture of how perfect everything would be once the renovations were complete. "You're always saying you want a comfortable home to come back to," she argued. "This is it. This is our chance to make that happen. Don't you think it's worth the extra effort?" Her persistence was exhausting, but she wasn't wrong. The renovations were already underway, and stopping now would mean wasting all the time and money we'd already invested. That night, I stayed up late, running the numbers in my head and considering my options. By morning, I had made up my mind. If we were going to push forward with this, I needed a way to bring in more income to cover the additional costs. At work, I approached my supervisor to discuss opportunities for extra assignments or projects. To my surprise, he had an immediate suggestion. "There's a week-long business trip coming up," he said. "It's not glamorous, but the pay is triple the usual rate. If you're interested, it's yours." The decision wasn't difficult. A week away from home would be inconvenient, but the financial benefit was too good to pass up. "I'll take it," I said without hesitation. Arrangements were quickly made, and I left the office feeling a mix of relief and determination. At least now, I had a plan to tackle the mounting expenses. When I got home, I sat my wife down to explain the situation. "I found a way to make this work," I told her. "I'm taking on a short-term assignment that'll bring in the extra money we need. It means I'll be away for a week, but it'll cover the costs of the new project." Her face lit up with relief and excitement. "Thank you," she said, throwing her arms around me. "I promise you won't regret this." For the first time in days, I felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. The day finally came when the renovation team was scheduled to return to continue their work. I got home from the office later than usual, tired and ready to relax, but what greeted me left me both puzzled and annoyed. The builders were scattered around the house, some shirtless, others wearing shorts so short they might as well have been underwear. I stared for a moment, trying to make sense of the scene, before heading inside to find my wife. "What's going on?" I asked her, gesturing toward the half-dressed workers. She didn't seem fazed. "Oh, they said it's too hot to work in full clothes," she explained casually. "I told them it's fine as long as they're getting the job done." "What's the harm?" Her tone was light, almost dismissive, but it only made my discomfort grow. This wasn't the kind of environment I wanted in my home. I decided not to argue, though the situation nagged at me. It felt like one more thing in a growing list of oddities surrounding this renovation. Instead, I focused on what I needed to share with her. "By the way," I said, "I got confirmation about my work trip. I'll be leaving in a week and gone for about 4 days." She nodded, seemingly unbothered. "That's perfect timing," she said. "By then, the basement should be nearly finished." All that'll be left is installing the furniture. The week went by faster than I expected. The builders continued their work, and I busied myself preparing for the trip. On the day of my departure, I gave my wife a quick rundown of what she might need to handle while I was gone. She assured me everything would be fine, and I left, trying to push aside the lingering unease I felt about the project. For the first couple of days, things seemed normal enough. I checked in with her a few times, but our conversations were brief. She seemed distracted, and then, by the third day, she stopped answering her phone altogether. Initially, I chalked it up to her being busy with the builders or other errands. But by the evening, my frustration had turned into concern. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, as if on cue, my phone rang. It was my neighbor. "Hey," he said, his tone cautious. "I know you're out of town, but I thought you should know something. Your wife mentioned the renovation, right?" I confirmed, wondering where this was going. "Well," he continued, "I've noticed something odd. Usually, the workers leave in the evening, but for the past 3 nights, their trucks have been parked outside late into the night. I thought maybe they were just working overtime, but considering, the argument you had with them, I figured it's worth mentioning." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced as I tried to process what he was saying. "You're sure about this?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rising anger. He assured me he was. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he added, "but it seemed strange. I thought you'd want to know." After the call ended, I sat there in silence, my thoughts spiraling. Everything started to click: my wife's distracted behavior, the missed calls, and now this. It was too much to ignore. I needed to get back home and find out what was really going on. Without wasting a moment, I began planning how to cut my trip short and return earlier than expected. Whatever was happening, I wasn't going to sit idly by and let it continue unchecked. The next morning, my wife called me, her tone cheerful and upbeat. "The furniture has arrived," she said. "There's not much left to do now." I told her I'd be home a day or 2 later than expected, blaming work for the delay. "That's fine," she replied. "Everything should be finished by then." Her casual response didn't ease my growing suspicion, but I kept my thoughts to myself. The moment the call ended, I started making plans to return home earlier than she expected. I wrapped up my work commitments as quickly as possible and drove home that same evening. When I pulled up to the house, the builders' trucks were still parked outside. It was late, far past the usual hours they worked. My unease deepened as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. The front door was unlocked, so I let myself in, moving quietly through the entryway. Near the basement door, I noticed a strange puddle of liquid on the floor. It didn't look like water, and I couldn't immediately place what it was. My instincts told me to stay cautious. Slowly, I descended the basement stairs, careful not to make any noise. What I saw when I reached the bottom was beyond anything I could have imagined. My wife, along with the builders, was caught in an act that left no room for misinterpretation. For a moment, I simply stood there, frozen in shock. Then, I pulled out my phone and began recording. None of them noticed me, too engrossed in their actions to sense my presence. Once I had enough footage, I turned and walked back upstairs, my mind racing. Anger surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing control wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I came up with a plan. I locked the basement door from the outside, securing it with the key. Then, I left the key in the lock, ensuring they couldn't open it from their side. For the next few hours, the house was eerily quiet. But eventually, the banging started. Fists pounded on the basement door, followed by muffled shouts. The door stuck, someone yelled. "What's going on?" Their panic grew as time passed. I sat in the living room, waiting, my mind already planning my next move. When the noise from the basement reached a fever pitch, I walked to the hallway and called out. "The door's not stuck," I said loudly enough for them to hear. "It's locked." "You're not going anywhere." Their protests grew louder, but I ignored them. Instead, I gathered all the clothes they had left in the living room and threw them into the garbage bin outside. They wouldn't be needing them anytime soon. The next day, after a full 24 hours of leaving them locked up, I called the police. "There are intruders in my house," I told the dispatcher. "I caught them in the act and locked them in the basement. Can you send someone over?" When the officers arrived, I unlocked the basement door and stepped aside as they entered. The builders and my wife scrambled out, looking disheveled and desperate. The builders immediately started shouting accusations. "He locked us in," one of them said. "We're the crew working on his house." "He's lying." I calmly countered their claims. "I just got back from a business trip," I explained to the officers. "If you don't believe me, you can confirm my alibi with my boss and my neighbor. They'll tell you when I returned." The officers made their calls, and my story checked out. Meanwhile, the builders fumbled, unable to produce any contract or documentation proving they had a legitimate reason to be in my house. By the end of the ordeal, the police escorted the builders off the property. My wife and I were left alone in the aftermath. She stood there, avoiding my gaze, knowing there was no way to explain or justify what had happened. The silence between us was deafening, and the weight of her betrayal hung heavy in the air. As soon as the police left and the door closed, the tension in the house reached its breaking point. My wife, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "How could you do that?" she demanded, her voice sharp and filled with anger. "Locking them in the basement? Calling the police? Do you even realize what you've done?" Her words were accusatory, as if she were the one who had been wronged. I didn't flinch. "What I did?" I shot back. "You're questioning my actions when you're the one who betrayed me. Don't you dare try to turn this around. You have no right." My voice was steady, but my anger simmered beneath the surface. She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. "No," I said firmly. "You don't get to speak. Not after what you've done." She tried to defend herself, her tone becoming desperate. "It wasn't what it looked like," she began, but I wasn't having it. "Save it," I said coldly. "I don't want your excuses. There's nothing you can say that will undo what I saw." "Nothing." She fell silent, realizing that her words would carry no weight with me. Without another word, I walked past her and headed to the bedroom. I grabbed a suitcase and began pulling her clothes from the closet, tossing them in without care. "What are you doing?" she cried, following me. "Stop. You can't just throw me out like this." Her voice rose in pitch, but I didn't stop. The betrayal was too fresh, too deep. There was no room for reconciliation in my mind. "Watch me," I said bluntly, continuing to pack her belongings. She tried to grab the suitcase from me, but I pulled it away. "You're leaving," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm not staying in this house with you for another second. You've crossed the line, and there's no coming back from this." She began to cry, not out of remorse but frustration. "You don't have the right to do this," she screamed. "This is my home too." I turned to face her, my expression hardened. "No," I said. "It's not. I paid for this house. I've spent months working my ass off to turn it into something we could both enjoy. And you've done nothing but betray that effort. So, no, you don't get to stay." She tried to argue, her words coming out in a jumbled mess of anger and desperation, but I wasn't listening anymore. I zipped up the suitcase and pushed it toward the door. "Take it and go," I said firmly. "You're not welcome here anymore." She stood there, stunned, as if she couldn't believe I was serious. But when I opened the door and stepped aside, the reality of the situation finally hit her. "You'll regret this," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "You can't just get rid of me like this. I'll fight you for everything." I shook my head. "Do what you want," I said. "But this marriage is over. You're getting out of my house, and you're not coming back. Now leave." Her protests continued, but they fell on deaf ears as I guided her out the door and closed it behind her. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was also a relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control over my life again. A few days after everything had seemingly settled, the construction crew showed up at my doorstep. Their faces were a mix of smugness and feigned professionalism. "We're here to talk about payment," the leader said, his tone carrying a hint of menace. "You owe us for the work we've done." I stared at them for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Then, with a calm voice, I replied, "You mean payment for betrayal?" "Sure, I've got something for you." Without waiting for a response, I walked into the house, grabbed the trash bin that had been sitting by the back door, and returned to the window overlooking where they stood. Their expressions changed to confusion as I hoisted the bin and dumped its contents out the window, letting garbage rain down on them. "There's your payment," I said coldly. "Now get off my property." Their shock quickly turned to anger. "You'll regret this," one of them shouted, shaking his fist. "You better watch your back." I didn't flinch. Instead, I closed the window and walked away, refusing to engage further. Their threats were empty words to me at that moment, but little did I know how far they'd be willing to go. Over the next few days, I focused on legal matters, consulting with my lawyer to ensure everything was in order. Divorce proceedings were already underway, and I wanted to make sure I was protected from any additional fallout from the renovation debacle. My lawyer assured me that I was on solid ground, especially since there were no formal contracts with the crew. But the builders weren't done. Late one night, my neighbor called me, sounding alarmed. "I think something's going on near your house," he said. "There's a couple of guys near your car with what looks like a gas can." My heart sank as I quickly checked the security feed on my phone. Sure enough, two figures were lurking near the driveway, their movements suspicious. I called the police immediately, explaining the situation. As I waited for them to arrive, I stayed inside, watching through the window as the men began dousing my car with gasoline. They were sloppy, their movements rushed and panicked. It was clear they had no experience with this kind of thing. Within minutes, the flashing lights of a police car illuminated the street, and the two men froze like deer caught in headlights. The officers apprehended them on the spot. As they were handcuffed and led away, I stepped outside to watch. One of the men tried to plead his case. "It wasn't what it looked like," he said, "but the evidence was clear. The gas can, the matches in his pocket, and the security footage I provided left no room for doubt." At the station, their stories fell apart quickly under questioning. What started as a petty act of revenge escalated into a serious charge. This time, there were no excuses, no loopholes to exploit. The police informed me that the men were being charged with attempted arson, a crime that carried significant consequences. Unlike their first brush with the law, this incident ensured they wouldn't be walking away so easily. The day of the divorce proceedings came faster than I had expected, but I was ready. Armed with undeniable evidence of her betrayal, the process was swift and decisive. The judge reviewed the documentation I provided, including the video footage and statements from witnesses, and ruled in my favor. My wife's arguments, weak and unconvincing, were dismissed without much consideration. By the end of the hearing, I walked out of the courtroom knowing that the chapter of my life with her was officially over. With the divorce finalized, I turned my focus back to the house. The renovations had been tainted by the events surrounding them, but I refused to let that ruin my plans. Calling on a few close friends, I decided to finish the work myself. Over the course of several weekends, we repainted the walls, fixed the remaining issues, and restored order to the home. It was hard work, but it felt good to reclaim the space on my own terms. The basement, however, required a different approach. I couldn't look at it without being reminded of everything that had happened. So, I stripped it bare, removing all traces of the so-called intimate space my wife had envisioned. Instead of turning it into anything elaborate, I decided to use it for storage. Old boxes, tools, and seasonal decorations now occupied the space. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical, and more importantly, it was mine. One of the first changes I made after the divorce was to replace all the locks in the house. The property was legally mine, a fact that the court had affirmed during the proceedings. My wife hadn't contributed a single penny to the purchase or renovation of the home. It was my hard work that had paid for everything, and I wasn't about to let her have any claim to it now. Changing the locks felt symbolic, a way of closing the door on the past and securing a new beginning. Life slowly began to settle into a new normal. Without the constant drama and tension, I found peace in the small things. I took up hobbies I had neglected, spent more time with friends, and focused on my work. The house, once a source of stress and conflict, became a haven. It was quiet, organized, and finally felt like a place I could truly call home. Then, one day, she showed up. My ex-wife stood on the porch, her expression a mix of desperation and regret. She begged me to take her back, promising that things would be different this time. I listened without interrupting, letting her say her piece. When she was finished, I looked her in the eye and said firmly, "No. You made your choices, and I've made mine. This door is closed." She left, tears in her eyes, and I felt no remorse. My decision was final. She eventually moved in with her parents, where I heard she'd been staying ever since. We had no further contact after that day. I didn't block her number or go out of my way to avoid her, but there was no reason for our paths to cross again. I had moved on, and so, it seemed, had she. The chapter was closed, and I had no intention of reopening it. In the end, life turned out well for me. The house stood as a testament to my resilience, a place where I could build new memories and leave the past behind. My ex-wife's absence became a distant memory, and the peace that followed her departure was more than enough. The story had reached its conclusion, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free.